If you can't afford to pay, then let it die. The pharmacist sneered at the sobbing young woman, refusing to help her sick puppy and dismissing her out into the storm. He thought her weak, but he hadn't noticed the quiet shadow in the aisle. A Navy SEAL who knew that the strongest among us are sworn to protect the weak, and he was about to make sure that promise was kept. The cold, wet air of western Pennsylvania clung to Caleb Cal Rourke like a second skin, a familiar, bone-deep chill that was a shock after months deployed in desert heat. At 38, Cal was a man who took up space even when trying to be invisible. He stood 6'4", his shoulders straining the dark flannel of his shirt. He moved with the quiet, calculated grace of a predator, a habit ingrained from years as a Navy SEAL that he couldn't quite shake, even on American soil. A thin, jagged white scar traced his jawline, a souvenir from a mission gone wrong in a place most people couldn't find on a map. But it was his eyes that truly defined him. They were dark and watchful, constantly scanning his surroundings, yet they held a deep, weary warmth that softened his otherwise intimidating presence. He walked down the cracked asphalt streets of Ironwood, a town built on steel and now resting on grit. The uneven pavement was slick with the freezing rain of an approaching nor'easter. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows on the brick row houses whose windows were dark against the early night. It was a tough town, steeped in a history of hard work and harder times, and tonight, the threatening sky turned the usually stoic Rust Belt atmosphere into something brooding and volatile. Thunder cracked in the distance, a low rumble that vibrated in Cal's chest, mirroring the dull ache in his left shoulder. That pain was a constant companion, a reminder of shrapnel and surgery, and it always flared up when the barometric pressure dropped. He needed pain relief, and he needed it before morning. He'd promised his father, a retired steel worker with bad knees and a stubborn sense of pride, that they would go hunting at dawn. It was a ritual they hadn't shared in 3 years, and Cal refused to let his own physical pain ruin the few precious hours he had with his old man. He turned a corner, looking for a specific shop he remembered from his youth, a place that seemed immune to the modernization creeping into the rest of the town. There it was, nestled between a shuttered hardware store and a vape shop, Finch's Pharmacy. The gold lettering on the window was slightly peeling, and the display behind the glass, antique mortars and pestles, dried herbs in bundles, and porcelain jars, looked as though it hadn't been touched since the mills were at full roar. Cal pushed open the heavy oak door, a brass bell announcing his arrival with a sharp, clean ring that cut through the shop's silence. Inside, Finch's Pharmacy smelled of peppermint, old paper, and antiseptic, a scent that instantly transported Cal back to being a 10-year-old boy fetching cough medicine for his mother. The floor was blackened white checkered tile worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and the shelves were floor-to-ceiling mahogany, stocked with a mix of modern medicines and old-fashioned remedies. The light was dim, supplied by vintage fixtures that cast a weak, yellow glow over the merchandise. Standing behind the highly polished wooden counter was the proprietor, Arthur Finch. Arthur was a man who looked as though he'd been dried and preserved along with his herbs. He was thin and tall with wispy, graying hair slicked close to his skull and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his pale, judgmental blue eyes. He wore a starched white pharmacist's coat buttoned to the chin, his thin lips perpetually pursed in a line of disapproval. As Cal walked down the narrow aisle, he felt like a bull in a china shop, hyper-aware of his size and the cramped space. He kept his hands close to his sides to avoid knocking over displays of expensive soaps and fragile glass bottles. Arthur looked up from a ledger he was writing in, his eyes narrowing as he sized Cal up. He offered no greeting, just a stiff, slight nod that conveyed more suspicion than hospitality. Cal ignored the cold reception. He was used to the stares. He was used to being the biggest threat in the room. He moved to the section labeled pain relief, his large fingers hovering over the plastic bottles. He picked up a bottle of extra-strength ibuprofen and a tube of muscle rub that smelled sharply of menthol. These small, mundane items felt ridiculous in his hands trained to dismantle weapons and carry wounded men. Yet, they were the only weapons he had against the storm building in his joints. As he stood there, reading the back of the bottle to kill time, his guard was down, just for a moment. The quiet of the shop was heavy, broken only by the scratching of Arthur's pen and the distant thunder, which was growing louder, closer. Cal took a deep breath, trying to settle the restlessness in his soul. Coming home was sometimes harder than being away. Over there, the mission was clear: survive, protect, complete the objective. Here, the objectives were blurred. How to talk to his father without bringing up the things he'd seen. How to sleep without a weapon under his pillow. How to walk into a pharmacy without checking for the exits. He turned to approach the counter, the floorboards groaning under the weight of his combat boots. He set the items on the wood, the plastic making a soft clatter. Arthur Finch glanced at the items, then at Cal, his nose wrinkling slightly as if the smell of rain and ozone clinging to Cal's jacket was offensive. "Will that be all?" Arthur asked, his voice reedy and thin, lacking any warmth. "Yes, that's it," Cal replied, his deep baritone seeming to vibrate the glass jars on the shelves. He reached for his wallet, a worn and softened leather bifold. Just as he was pulling out a few bills, the atmosphere in the shop changed in a heartbeat. The wind outside howled, rattling the plate glass window, and the brass bell over the door didn't just ring. It clanged frantically as the door was thrown open. A blast of damp, freezing air rushed into the climate-controlled sanctuary of the pharmacy, carrying with it the smell of rain and desperation. Cal instinctively turned, his body squaring toward the entrance, his muscles tensed for a threat. But it wasn't a threat. It was a girl. Mia Torres stumbled into the shop, struggling to pull the heavy door closed against the wind. She was small, maybe 24, with a frame that looked too fragile to withstand the gale outside. She wore the thin, cheap uniform of a cleaner from one of the downtown business hotels, a black dress with a white collar, now soaked through and clinging to her trembling skin. Her hair, a tangled, dark mess, was plastered to her forehead, dripping water into her eyes. But it was her eyes that seized Cal's attention. They were huge, brown, and filled with a raw, terrifying panic. She wasn't alone. Cradled tightly to her chest, wrapped in a coarse, wet, gray wool blanket, was a shifting bundle. She held it as if it were the crown jewels, or something far more precious. She was gasping for breath, her sneakers making squeaking sounds on the pristine tiles as she took another step into the light, leaving a trail of muddy water behind her. She looked from Cal to Arthur, her lower lip trembling uncontrollably. She looked like a creature that had been hunted, cornered, and had nowhere left to run. The contrast between the quiet, orderly, sterile pharmacy and the chaotic, wet reality she brought in with her was jarring. Cal stood silent, his hand frozen halfway to his wallet, observing her. He saw the way her knuckles were white from gripping the bundle. He heard a faint, low whimper coming from within the blanket. It wasn't a baby. It was an animal. And the girl looked as though her entire world was ending right there on the black and white checkered floor. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind Mia, cutting off the howl of the wind but trapping the bone-deep chill inside with her. She stood dripping on the black and white tiles, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The air in the pharmacy, tasting of camphor and rubbing alcohol, was a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the storm outside. In her arms, the wet gray wool bundle felt terrifyingly heavy, not with physical weight, but with the struggling life inside it. Kaiser, her 6-month-old German Shepherd mix, let out a low, gurgling moan that vibrated against her ribs, a sound that tore at her heart like a serrated knife. Just hours earlier, she'd been scrubbing the marble floors of the Omni Hotel, her knees aching and her hands raw from harsh chemicals, counting down the minutes until she could return to the small, drafty basement apartment she called home. It was a grueling 12-hour shift, one of many she took without complaint, driven by the singular goal of sending every spare penny back to her mother in rural Pennsylvania. Her mom was fighting a chronic respiratory illness, and the medication was expensive, leaving Mia with just enough for ramen noodles and her share of the rent. But she didn't mind the hardship. She was young, she was strong, and she had Kaiser. The welcome she'd received tonight, however, had shattered her routine. Instead of the usual enthusiastic barks and the click-clack of paws on linoleum, she had found Kaiser curled in a corner, surrounded by bile, his body radiating a heat that burned her hands. His eyes, usually bright and full of mischief, were dull and sunken, and he barely lifted his head when she called his name. Panic, cold and sharp, had seized her. She'd checked her wallet, though she already knew the answer. 3 crumpled $1 bills and a handful of change were all that was left after yesterday's wire transfer. The emergency vet clinic required a deposit she couldn't dream of, and the animal shelter was closed. This old pharmacy, its lights flickering in the rain, was her only hope, a desperate gamble that maybe, just maybe, she could find something, anything, to bring his fever down. As she stood at the entrance, water pooling around her worn-out sneakers, Mia felt the weight of her poverty. It wasn't just the absence of money. It was the absence of options, the suffocating feeling that the world was a series of closed doors for which she had no key. She clutched the puppy tighter, shielding his head from the harsh fluorescent lights. Her mind flashed to the day she'd found him, 3 months ago, on a night not unlike this one. He'd been a scrawny, flea-bitten thing, shivering behind a dumpster in the alley behind the hotel, discarded like trash because of a slightly crooked tail and a limp in his back leg. He had looked at her with a silent plea so profound she couldn't walk away. She had named him Kaiser, shared her meager dinners with him, and in return, he had given her something money could never buy, unconditional love and a reason to keep going when the loneliness of the city threatened to swallow her whole. He was her family, her protector, her silent confidant who listened to her dreams of one day going to nursing school. Now, feeling his tiny heart beating erratically against her arm, the terror of losing him made her knees weak. She wasn't just holding a dog, she was holding the only living being in this city who cared that she existed. Mia forced herself to move, her wet sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. She was acutely aware of the eyes on her. To her left, near the pain relief aisle, was a man who looked like he could move mountains. Cal, though she didn't know his name yet, a towering figure in a flannel shirt who seemed to fill the aisle. He was intimidating, certainly, with his broad shoulders and commanding presence, but her focus couldn't linger on him. Her gaze was fixed on the counter at the back, where the man in the white coat stood like a gatekeeper to her salvation. Arthur Finch stared at her over the rim of his glasses, his expression one of undisguised distaste. To him, she knew she looked like trouble, a wet, dirty girl carrying a wet, dirty animal into his pristine establishment. She could see his nose wrinkle, probably smelling the damp dog fur and the rain on her. Shame burned her cheeks hotter than Kaiser's fever. She hated asking for help. She was raised to work for what she needed, never to ask for a handout, to hold on to her pride. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford tonight. Every step toward the counter felt like walking through molasses. The silence in the store was deafening, amplified by the raging storm outside. She tried to form the words in her head, rehearsing a plea that would sound dignified, but her mind was a jumble of fear and exhaustion. Please, just some antibiotics. Please, something for the nausea. I'll scrub your floors. I'll wash your windows. The thoughts raced, colliding with the reality of the stern face awaiting her. Kaiser made another sound, a retching gasp that shook his whole body, and Mia instinctively swayed with him, whispering soft, nonsensical reassurances into his wet fur. She reached the counter, the wood tall and imposing, making her feel like a child called to the principal's office. Arthur Finch didn't speak. He just waited, his pen hovering over his ledger, his silence a weapon designed to make her feel small, to make her turn and leave. But she couldn't leave. She held her ground, took a shaky breath that hitched in her chest, and looked up into his cold, watery eyes. The warmth of the shop, which should have been comforting, felt suffocating, closing in around her. She was 24 years old. She had survived hunger and loneliness, but standing here, begging for the life of her best friend from a man who clearly had no mercy to give, was the hardest thing she had ever done. The air was tense, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil inside. When she finally found it, Mia's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible over the hum of the refrigeration units. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white against the dark mahogany, trying to steady herself as the room seemed to spin. Sir, please, she began, her eyes fixed on Arthur Finch's glasses, unable to meet his gaze directly. My dog, Kaiser, he's very sick. I think it's parvo, or maybe a bad stomach infection. He's dehydrated. He's running a high fever. She swallowed hard against the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. I don't have the money for the emergency vet tonight. I just sent my paycheck to my mother. But I know sometimes pharmacies have stock that's about to expire, or maybe a generic brand that's damaged. Just some antibiotics and rehydration salts. Anything. The words came out in a rush, as if she feared that if she paused, he would order her out before she could finish. I can work it off. I'm a cleaner at the Omni. I'm a good worker. I can come back tomorrow morning before my shift and scrub your floors. I can wash the windows. I'll do whatever you need until it's paid for. Please, he's all I have. Arthur Finch didn't move. He stood as still as the ceramic jars on the shelves behind him, his face unreadable except for a slight curling of his upper lip. He took a slow, deliberate breath, inhaling deeply as if testing the air for contaminants. He glanced down at her hands, red and chapped from harsh hotel cleaning chemicals and trembling, then shifted his gaze to the muddy puddle forming around her cheap sneakers. Work it off, he repeated, his voice as dry and scratching as sandpaper. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The quiet contempt was far more cutting. Young lady, this is a reputable establishment, not some back alley barter market. We deal in currency, not in vague promises of labor from transient workers. He closed the ledger he'd been writing in with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet store like a gunshot. Do you have a prescription? No, sir. The vet is closed, and I told you I can't. No prescription, no money, Arthur interrupted, his tone bored, and you're asking me to dispense medication, potentially controlled substances, for a stray you've brought in with a dying animal. Are you aware of the liability, the regulations? He leaned forward slightly, the light glinting off his glasses, making his eyes disappear into blank white circles. And frankly, look at you. You can't even keep yourself dry, let alone care for a German Shepherd. That breed requires resources, discipline, and stability. Things you clearly lack. Mia felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't just a refusal. It was a dissection of her entire existence. Kaiser let out a high-pitched whine from within the blanket, a sound of pure misery that made Mia flinch. She pulled the bundle closer, rocking him gently. "He's not a burden," she whispered, the tears finally breaking free, hot and humiliating. "He's my family. Please, sir, just a little compassion. He's in pain." Arthur sighed, a long, exasperated sound. He glanced past Mia to the other side of the store. An older woman, Mrs. Peterson, was browsing the vitamins. She was a regular, a pearl-wearing churchgoer. Mrs. Peterson glanced up at the commotion, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the scene of the desperate, wet girl and the stern pharmacist. For a second, Mia hoped for an ally, for someone to intervene, but Mrs. Peterson quickly looked away, suddenly finding the calcium supplements intensely interesting, retreating into the safety of non-involvement. Mia was on her own. "Compassion," Arthur scoffed, picking up a cloth to wipe an invisible speck of dust from the counter. "Compassion is making responsible choices, young lady. Cruelty is taking on a life you cannot support. You people always do this. You acquire these animals for your own comfort. To make yourselves feel better, with no thought for the cost." He pointed a long, bony finger at the muddy footprints on his floor. "You're contaminating my store. You're disturbing my paying customers, and you're wasting my time." "I'll clean up the mess," Mia sobbed, her pride completely shattered. "I promise. Just please help him." "Get out," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder, harder. "I will not repeat myself. Take that filthy thing out of here." "But he'll die," Mia cried, her desperation making her voice crack. "If I go back out there, he won't make it through the night." Arthur Finch looked at the trembling bundle in her arms with utter indifference. He straightened his pristine white coat, ensuring it hung perfectly. "Then let nature take its course," he said, the words hanging in the air like poison. "If you cannot afford to keep it alive, then you have no business prolonging its suffering. It's a mercy, really. Let it die and save yourself the expense. Now leave, before I call the police for trespassing." The cruelty of the statement was a physical blow. She stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, unable to process how a human being could look at a suffering creature and speak of its death so casually. The warmth of the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold that started in her chest and spread to her fingertips. She clutched Kaiser so tightly she feared she might hurt him, but he just lay limp against her, his breath shallow and quick. She wanted to scream, to shatter the glass cabinets, to make this man feel a fraction of the pain she was feeling. But she was powerless. She was just a cleaning girl with an empty pocket and a dying dog. Defeated, she bowed her head, tears dripping from her chin onto the gray wool blanket. She turned away slowly, her feet feeling like lead, the sound of her own heartbeat deafening. She had failed him. She had failed the only friend she had. As she took a single step toward the door, the bell above it now silent, the hopeless reality of the storm outside waited to swallow them whole. A shadow detached itself from the pain relief aisle. She hadn't really noticed the big man standing there before, or perhaps she'd been too focused on Arthur. But now, as she prepared to step back into the rain to let her dog die, the air in the shop changed again, not from the wind, but from the sheer force of the presence stepping into her path. The bell over the door remained silent, but the atmosphere in the room changed with the sudden, crushing gravity of a collapsing star. Mia had taken one step toward the rainy abyss when a hand, large and calloused, gently touched her shoulder. It wasn't a grab. It was a barrier, solid and uncompromising, halting her retreat. She looked up, startled, tears blurring her vision into the face of the man in the flannel shirt, who now towered over her. Up close, Cal Rourke was even more imposing. The fluorescent lights deepened the shadows in his cheekbones and highlighted the jagged white scar that ran along his jaw, a permanent map of violence that stood in stark contrast to the soft, steady gaze he gave her. He said nothing to her, just gave a single nod, a silent promise that she was no longer fighting alone. Then, he shifted his attention to the counter. The sound of his combat boots on the tile was heavy and rhythmic, a slow, deliberate march that echoed like a battle drum in the quiet shop. Mrs. Peterson, still feigning interest in vitamins, froze, her instincts screaming that a predator had just entered the ecosystem. Arthur Finch, who had been smugly wiping his counter, stopped mid-swipe. The condescending smirk on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of primal unease as Cal approached. Cal didn't stop until his chest was against the high wooden counter, his sheer size making the barrier between pharmacist and customer seem ridiculously fragile. He placed his hands flat on the polished wood. They were hands that had dug trenches, dismantled explosives, and held dying men. They were scarred, thick, and impossibly steady. He leaned forward, invading Arthur's personal space, forcing the pharmacist to take an instinctive step back. "You've got a lot of opinions for a man who sells aspirin," Cal said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, subterranean rumble, a baritone frequency that seemed to vibrate in the listener's chest rather than their ears. It was the voice of a man who never had to shout to be obeyed. "She asked for help. She offered to work, and you treated her like something you scrape off your boot." Arthur swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his thin throat. He adjusted his glasses, attempting to regain his composure. "Now, you listen here," Arthur stammered, his voice rising an octave. "I run a business. I have policies. I can't simply give away inventory for every sob story that walks in off the street. And that animal is a health code violation." Cal's eyes flickered to the bundle in Mia's arms. He could see the tips of the puppy's ears, big, velvety triangles that were a little too large for its head. A German shepherd. A wave of memory washed over Cal, sudden and sharp. He wasn't just seeing a sick puppy. He was seeing the ghosts of the K9 unit he'd worked with in the chaotic heat of Kandahar. He remembered Loki, a Belgian Malinois who had taken a bullet meant for Cal, a creature of pure, unflinching loyalty who never asked for a paycheck, only a pat on the head. To Cal, a working dog wasn't a pet. It was a teammate, a soul with a clarity of purpose that humans rarely achieved. To see a shepherd, even a mutt puppy, dismissed as trash, ignited a cold, controlled fury in his gut. He looked back at Arthur, his gaze hardening into something sharp as diamond. "That is not an animal," Cal corrected, his voice even lower, laced with danger. "That is a life. A German shepherd. That breed would run into a fire for you if you treated it right. But I wouldn't expect a man who measures his worth in ledger lines to understand loyalty." Arthur bristled, his pride stung. "I don't have to listen to this. Who do you think you are? I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Cal challenged, not blinking. "Tell them a Navy SEAL is in your lobby requesting to purchase medical supplies, and you're refusing service. Let's see how that plays with your reputation in this town." The mention of Navy SEAL hung in the air like smoke. Arthur went pale. In a military-heavy town like Ironwood, disrespecting a veteran, especially a SEAL, was social suicide. The power dynamic had inverted instantly. Arthur was no longer dealing with a transient, he was dealing with a local hero, a man whose violence was state-sanctioned.
I didn't know," Arthur stammered, searching for a retreat strategy.
"Apologize," Cal commanded. "That wasn't a request. To the girl. Now." Arthur hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line, but one look at Cal's unmoving posture broke his resistance. He looked past Cal to Mia, who was watching with wide, disbelieving eyes.
I apologize for my tone, miss," Arthur mumbled, staring at the floor.
"Good," Cal said, cutting him off before he could add any excuses. "Now we're going to do some business." He pointed a finger at the shelves behind Arthur. "I want the best broad-spectrum antibiotic you have that's safe for canines. I want 3 cans of that high-calorie recovery wet food on the top shelf. I want a pediatric electrolyte solution, unflavored, and throw in a basic first aid kit, clean gauze, and a bottle of antiseptic." Arthur blinked, confused by the specificity of the order.
I can't sell antibiotics without a vet's prescription."
"You have over-the-counter livestock antibiotics in the back for the farm supply section, don't you?" Cal cut in, knowing exactly how old pharmacies in this part of the country worked. "Don't lie to me. Get it in the food. Now." Arthur scrambled. He moved faster than he had all night, grabbing cans from the shelf and disappearing into a back room, returning seconds later with a small vial of liquid medicine and the requested supplies. He piled them on the counter, his hands shaking slightly. "That will be. With the premium food." Arthur began to calculate, his greed warring with his fear. Cal didn't let him finish. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a thick leather wallet. He withdrew a wad of cash, money he'd been saving for the hunting trip and new gear for his father, and slapped it on the counter. The sound was a sharp thud that made Mrs. Peterson jump. It was far more than the items were worth. "Keep the change," Cal said, his voice cold and final. "But let's be clear about one thing. This money isn't for you. It's a tax for being a small, cruel man." He leaned in one last time, his face inches from Arthur's. "The next time someone comes in here begging for a life, you remember tonight. You remember that kindness costs nothing, but being a bastard can get expensive." He grabbed the bag of supplies, turned his back on the stunned pharmacist, and walked toward Mia. The storm outside was still raging, but inside the air felt clearer, cleansed by the sudden, decisive strike of justice. He looked down at the trembling girl and her sick puppy, his expression softening from granite hard to something that looked like a sanctuary. "Let's go," he said gently, nodding toward the door. "Let's get him out of here." The transition from the sterile, judgmental air of the pharmacy to the raw fury of the storm was abrupt, but for Mia, it was a welcome release. The wind whipped her wet hair across her face, stinging her cheeks, but the heavy hand on her back, Cal's hand, guided her with a stability that made the gale feel manageable. He didn't rush, but his strides were long and purposeful, cutting a path through the driving rain toward an old, dark blue Ford F-150 parked under a flickering streetlight. It wasn't the sleek luxury car of a millionaire philanthropist, it was the truck of a working man, with mud-caked tires, a dent in the rear bumper, and a bed full of fishing coolers and tackle boxes covered by a tarp. Cal wrenched open the passenger door, the hinges letting out a rusty groan, and gestured for her to get in. "It's not much," he growled, his voice barely audible over a clap of thunder, "but the heater works better than most things in this town." She climbed inside, clutching Kaiser, and the moment the door slammed shut, the noise of the world was instantly muffled, replaced by the smell of old leather, a pine tree air freshener, and the faint scent of engine oil. It was the smell of safety. Cal circled the truck, his large frame hunched against the rain, and slid into the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he reached over and cranked the heat to full blast. The vents blasted hot air into the cab, clearing the condensation from the windows and beginning to melt the chill that had settled deep in Mia's bones. He switched on the dome light, casting a warm, amber glow that enclosed the small space. Without a word, he grabbed the bag of supplies from the dash and turned toward her, his knee bumping the gearshift in the cramped space. "Let me see him." He didn't wait for permission. He simply reached out and peeled back the wet, gray wool blanket. Kaiser lay limp, his breathing shallow and quick, his nose dry and hot. Mia watched, half mesmerized and half terrified, as Cal's demeanor shifted. The intimidating factor vanished, replaced by a focused, clinical tenderness. He wasn't just a big man anymore. He was a medic. He opened the bottle of electrolyte solution, measuring a precise amount into the cap. "He's dehydrated." "Skin's tenting," Cal murmured more to himself than to her, pinching the loose skin on Kaiser's neck. "We need to get fluids in him slowly. Too fast and he'll bring it right back up." He looked at Mia. "Hold his head steady, just like this." He guided her hands, his touch rough but careful, showing her how to support the puppy's jaw without impeding his airway. With a dexterity that belied his size, Cal used a small syringe from the first aid kit to dribble the fluid into the side of Kaiser's mouth, massaging his throat to encourage swallowing. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice dropping to a gentle rumble that seemed to mesmerize the dog. "That's it. Fight it, buddy." Mia watched the process, spellbound. She saw the scars on Cal's knuckles, the way his eyes tracked every tiny movement of the animal. You're really good at this," she stammered, her voice small in the cab. "Are you a doctor?" Cal let out a short, dry laugh, shaking his head as he opened a can of the high-calorie food, taking a small smear on his finger to rub onto the puppy's gums. "No, ma'am. Navy SEAL. I was a K-9 handler for 2 tours in Afghanistan. My job was to keep the dogs alive so they could keep us alive." He paused, his eyes clouding for a brief second as he focused on a patch of white fur on Kaiser's chest. "I had a partner, Loki, a Malinois. Looked a little like this one, only pointier ears. He took a piece of shrapnel for me in the Peck Valley. Tending to sick dogs was just something you learned when you were the only one standing between them and the end." Mia stared at him, wide-eyed. The pieces clicked into place. The truck, the scars, the command in his voice, and now this profound gentleness. He wasn't some rich businessman throwing money around to be nice. He was a soldier who understood pain. "I thought, when you paid all that money. I thought you were rich," she admitted, feeling foolish. "I'm not rich," Cal said simply, wiping his hands on a rag from the door pocket. "Just saved up some combat pay, and I know what it's like to be in a tight spot with a buddy who's hurt." He looked at her, then really looked at her, seeing past the cleaner's uniform and the grime. "You stood your ground in there. Most people would have walked away when Finch started yelling. You didn't. That tells me this little guy is lucky to have you." She felt a flush of pride warm her cheeks, so different from the shame she'd felt earlier. "He's all I have," she whispered. "My mom's sick back home, and it's been hard." "I know," Cal said, and she believed him. He finished applying a small amount of antibiotic paste to the back of Kaiser's tongue. Now we wait. The sugar in the paste should help him perk up, and the fluids will help with the fever. He wrapped the dry parts of the blanket snugly around the puppy, creating a cocoon. They sat in silence for several minutes, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the roof, the heater humming. It was a strange tableau, a soldier, a cleaning girl, and a dying dog in an old pickup truck. But to Mia, it felt like the first time she was part of a team. Suddenly, there was a shift in the bundle. Kaiser's ear twitched. Then his eyes opened, less dull than before. He let out a long sigh, not of pain, but of comfort. Slowly, weakly, he lifted his head. He looked at Mia, then turned his snout toward the source of warmth and the man who administered to him. Kaiser extended a rough, pink tongue and gave the back of Cal's scarred hand a single, tentative lick. It was a weak gesture, just one experimental swipe, but it was powerful. Cal went completely still. He looked down at the puppy, and the hard lines of his face completely softened, the soldier melting away to reveal the man underneath. He turned his hand over and gently scratched behind Kaiser's ears. "Yeah," Cal whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're still with us, warrior." Mia let out a sob she didn't realize she'd been holding back, a laugh bubbling up through the tears. In the amber light of the cab, with the storm raging uselessly outside, the three of them were connected by that single act of survival. It was a fragile victory, but in that moment, it felt big enough to conquer the world. The drive from the pharmacy to the address she had hesitantly given was short, but it took them across a jagged economic divide that split Ironwood in two. They left behind the struggling but proud main street for blocks where streetlights flickered with ominous irregularity and potholes were deep enough to swallow a hubcap. Cal drove the F-150 with a gentle precision that belied the truck's rugged suspension, mindful of the sick puppy now resting in Mia's lap. The only sounds in the cab were the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers fighting the relentless rain and the soft, wheezing breaths of Kaiser, who had finally fallen into a fitful sleep. When Cal pulled up in front of a dilapidated brick building that had been carved into cheap apartments, he felt a knot of concern tighten in his gut. The paint was peeling in long gray strips like dead skin, and the front steps sagged under the weight of years of neglect. It was the kind of place that held the damp and the cold, the worst possible environment for a recovering animal, or a struggling human. Mia fumbled with the door handle, turning to him with a look of profound gratitude that made Cal feel unworthy. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still thick with tears. "You didn't have to do any of this. The medicine, the ride. It's too much." Cal shook his head, cutting off her gratitude before it could become awkward. "Just get the door open," he said softly, grabbing the bag of supplies. He followed her down a narrow set of concrete stairs that led to a basement apartment. The air grew heavier as they descended, smelling of damp earth and old pipes. Mia unlocked the door with a key that stuck in the lock, requiring a practiced jiggle to open. When she pushed the door in and flipped on the single overhead light, Cal stepped inside and paused, his observant eyes taking in her entire world in a single sweep. It was one small room, barely a studio, with water stains blooming on the ceiling tiles like continents on a strange planet. But what struck Cal wasn't the poverty. It was the defiant dignity with which it was maintained. The linoleum floor was worn through in spots, but it was scrubbed clean, gleaming under the harsh bulb. The bed in the corner was made with military precision, the sheets thin but pulled taut. There was no clutter, no dirt, no chaos. On a small wooden table sat a single stack of books, used, dog-eared nursing textbooks, next to a glass jar holding a single, fresh daisy. It was the home of someone who refused to let their circumstances dictate their standards. Mia bustled around, clearing a spot on the threadbare rug for Kaiser. "Have a seat," she said, gesturing to the only chair, a wooden one with a mismatched cushion. I don't have much. No coffee or tea bags right now, I'm afraid, but I can boil some water. It's cold out." She looked at him with an earnestness that broke his heart. She was offering him hot water as if it were fine wine, because it was literally the only thing she had to give. "Hot water sounds perfect," Cal lied smoothly, sitting down carefully so as not to strain the chair's legs. "Keep the chill off." While Mia busied herself with a small electric kettle in the tiny kitchenette, Cal watched Kaiser. The puppy was settled on the rug, wrapped in a dry towel Mia had produced. The space was clean, yes, but the dampness was pervasive. He could feel it in his injured shoulder. He pulled his phone from his pocket, checking the signal. He needed backup. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Doc Jensen. Jensen was a retired Army vet who'd spent 30 years patching up working dogs in war zones before retiring to a small farm just outside of town. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man who preferred dogs to people, and Cal knew he was the only one who wouldn't charge an arm and a leg for a house call. Cal stepped out into the hallway for a better signal, speaking in a low, clipped tone, calling in a favor he'd been saving for years. When he came back in, Mia was setting a steaming mug of plain hot water on the table. "I've got a friend coming by in the morning," Cal announced, taking a sip of the hot water and acting as though it warmed his soul. "Name's Jensen. He's an old army vet. He's going to check on Kaiser, give him an 4 if he needs it. Make sure we didn't miss anything. You don't have to pay him. He owes me from a poker game in Kabul." It was a lie. Jensen didn't owe him a dime, but it was a necessary lie to protect her pride. Mia stopped mid-motion, her hand covering her mouth. You called a doctor." "He's retired," Cal shrugged. "Needs something to do besides yelling at his television." He stood up, the small room suddenly feeling too crowded with the emotion welling inside it. He checked on Kaiser one last time, satisfied that the puppy's breathing was deeper, more regular. "Keep him warm. Fluids every hour. Small amounts." Mia nodded, her eyes shining. "I don't know how to thank you, Cal. I really don't." "You already did," Cal answered. "By not giving up on him." He walked toward the door but paused by the small table with the daisy. While her back was turned, dampening a cloth at the sink to wipe Kaiser's face, Cal reached into his back pocket. He still had the envelope from the bank, the cash he'd withdrawn for the hunting trip. He hadn't used it all at the pharmacy. With a sleight of hand practiced in marketplaces across the Middle East, he tucked the thick envelope under the base of the glass jar holding the daisy. On the outside of the envelope, he'd scribbled a quick note in black marker back in the truck. Down payment on a future K9's handler. Take care of him. He moved away from the table before she could turn back. "I'm heading out. Jensen will be here at 0800. Be ready." Mia dried her hands on her apron and saw him to the door. "Drive safe, Cal," she said. And for the first time that night, she smiled, a genuine, tired, beautiful smile that lit up the gloomy basement. "You too, Mia," he said. He walked up the concrete steps and out into the rain, which had eased to a drizzle. He didn't look back. He got in his truck, started the engine, and drove off, leaving behind a young woman, a recovering puppy, and a secret that would change their lives the next time she lifted that jar. He hadn't just given medicine. He had given them a fighting chance. And as he drove toward the dark, quiet woods, Cal felt lighter than he had in years. The days after the storm brought a crisp, clean sunlight to Ironwood, drying the puddles on the asphalt but failing to erase the sudden chill that had settled over Finch's pharmacy. For Arthur Finch, the silence in his shop was louder than the thunder had been. In a town like Ironwood, where family lines and reputations were woven into the very fabric of the community, news traveled fast. Mrs. Peterson, the pearl-wearing witness to the events of that rainy night, had not kept quiet. She'd told her bridge club, who told their church choir, who mentioned it to the local grocer. The story of the heartless pharmacist and the veteran who stepped in spread through the grapevine with devastating efficiency. Customers didn't make a scene. That wasn't the way in this town. They simply stopped coming. The brass bell over the door, which normally rang every few minutes, remained stubbornly silent. When Arthur walked down the street for lunch, he felt the weight of averted gazes and hushed conversations. It wasn't a mob. It was an ostracism, a polite but firm social correction that left the old man to sit alone in his empty shop, staring at the dust motes dancing in the light, finally forced to face the reflection of the man he had become. While Arthur languished in a prison of his own making, Cal Rourke was busy building a future. He knew the cash he'd left under the daisy jar was a stopgap, a bandage on a gunshot wound. Mia didn't need charity. She needed stability. She needed a place where her hard work was valued and where her four-legged companion wasn't treated like a pest. Cal drove his F-150 out of the city limits, through rolling hills where the air smelled of damp earth and freedom, turning down a gravel road lined with old oak trees. The sign at the gate read, "Gunner's Landing, a retreat for veterans." This was the domain of Marcus Gunner Harrison. Gunner was a former Marine sergeant, a man carved from granite and grit who had lost his left leg to an Eid in Fallujah. He was 50, with a shaved head, a thick gray goatee, and a laugh that could shake leaves from the trees. He'd built this retreat as a sanctuary for returning vets to decompress, fish, and find their footing again. Cal found Gunner on the main lodge's wraparound porch, sanding a wooden rocking chair. "Rourke," Gunner boomed, setting down the sandpaper and maneuvering his prosthetic with practiced ease to give his friend a one-armed hug. "To what do I owe the honor? You finally get tired of the Navy?" "Not yet," Cal smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing in the presence of a brother in arms. "I need a favor, but I'm actually doing you one." Cal explained the situation, describing Mia's work ethic, The spotless basement apartment, the military-style bed-making, the dignity she maintained despite having nothing. He spoke of Kaiser and the need for a dog-friendly environment. Gunnar listened, stroking his goatee, his eyes thoughtful. "I've been looking for a head housekeeper for the cabins," Gunnar admitted. "Someone who takes pride in the details. The last guy I had thought dusting was a suggestion. If she's as good as you say. And she comes with a German Shepherd security system, send her over. I've got a staff cabin out back that's empty. It's got a fenced-in yard." The arrangement was sealed with a handshake, the currency of men like them. When Cal gave Mia the news later that afternoon, the look on her face was more precious than any medal he'd ever had pinned to his chest. It wasn't just relief. It was the restoration of hope. She wasn't being given a free ride, she was being offered a job, a purpose, and a home where Kaiser could run. She packed her few belongings in under an hour, leaving the damp basement behind for good. The transition was a blur of logistics and new beginnings, timed perfectly against the ticking clock of Cal's deployment. 2 days later, the morning sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the tall grasses at Gunnar's Landing. Cal pulled his truck up in front of the main lodge, the engine idling with a low rumble. He was in his uniform, his duffel bag packed in the back. His leave was over. The call had come, and he was heading back to the desert. He stepped out of the truck, adjusted his cover, needing to see it with his own eyes before he left. He didn't have to wait long. From the side of the staff cabin, a blur of black and tan shot across the lawn. Kaiser, no longer the trembling, dying creature from the pharmacy floor, was bounding toward him with the clumsy, joyful gait of a recovering puppy. His coat was clean, his eyes were bright and alert, and though he was still lean, the life radiating from him was undeniable. "Kaiser, come." Mia's voice rang out, clear and happy, a stark contrast to her broken whispers in the pharmacy. The puppy skidded to a halt a few feet from Cal, his tail wagging so hard his whole back half swayed with it. He recognized Cal, the scent, the presence, the rescuer. He let out one sharp, happy bark and trotted over, nudging his wet nose against Cal's combat boots. Cal knelt, ignoring the dirt on his uniform, and ruffled the dog's ears. "You're looking a lot better, warrior," Cal murmured, a lump forming in his throat. Mia walked up, wearing a neat polo shirt with the retreat's logo. She looked healthy, rested, and full of life. "He knew you were here," she said, her eyes shining. He heard the truck. She held out her hand, not as a beggar, but as an equal. "Thank you, Cal. For everything. Gunnar says I'm doing a great job. He likes how I organize the linen closets." "Gunnar's a tough man to please, so that's saying something," Cal replied, taking her hand in a firm shake. "You earned this. I just opened the door." He stood, towering over them both, but his shadow felt more protective than oppressive. "I have to go. Duty calls." Mia nodded, understanding the unspoken reality of his life. "We'll be here," she promised. "When you get back, there will be a fresh apple pie waiting for you, and Kaiser will be big enough to wrestle you properly." Cal smiled, a genuine grin that softened his warrior's face. "I'm looking forward to it." He climbed back into his truck, the engine roaring to life. As he drove down the gravel road, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw the silhouette of the girl and the dog, standing side by side, safe and strong against the rising sun. He wasn't just leaving a good deed behind. He was leaving a legacy of kindness that would grow in his absence. The mission ahead was dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, Cal Rourke felt completely at peace with what he was leaving behind. 6 months had passed since the rain-slicked streets of Ironwood faded from Cal Rourke's rearview mirror, replaced by the blinding, monochromatic beige of Kunar Province. The heat here was a physical weight that pressed down on the remote outpost where Cal and his team were stationed, a collection of HESCO barriers and canvas tents perched precariously on a rocky ridge. The air smelled of diesel fuel, burning trash, and ancient dust, a stark contrast to the salt air and jasmine of his home. It was mail call, the one ritual that could pause the relentless operational tempo of the SEAL platoon. A Black Hawk helicopter had just touched down, leaving bags of supplies and precious bundles of letters and packages from a world away. Cal sat on an overturned crate in the shade of a camouflage net, wiping sweat and grease from his brow with a rag. He wasn't expecting much. His father wasn't a letter writer, preferring short, awkward phone calls when the satellite link allowed. But the logistics sergeant tossed a padded brown envelope into his lap. It was light, carefully taped, and the handwriting on the front was feminine, neat, and unfamiliar. Still, it sparked a memory of a single, perfect white daisy in a glass jar. The return address read, Gunnar's Landing, Ironwood, Pennsylvania. Cal used his combat knife to slit the tape, his hands, usually rough with the tools of war, moving with surprising delicacy. Inside, there was no bulky care package of cookies or magazines, just a single folded sheet of notebook paper and a glossy 5 by 7 photograph. He unfolded the letter first. The paper was crisp, a relic from a civilized world that felt a million miles away. "Dear Cal," it began. "Gunnar told me this address would eventually find you. I hope you're safe. I wanted to tell you that the rainy season is over here, and everything is blooming." Cal leaned back against the sandbags, the hum of the generators fading as he read. Mia wrote about her life at the retreat, how she'd been put in charge of the housekeeping staff, and how the veterans there treated her like a little sister. But it was the second paragraph that made Cal's chest tighten. "I took the money you left under the jar," she wrote. "I didn't want to spend it, but Gunnar told me an investment is wasted if it just sits in an envelope. So, I enrolled in night classes at the community college. I'm studying to be a veterinary technician. Doc Jensen helped me with the application. He said I have a knack for difficult patients. I want to help animals the way you helped Kaiser. I want to be the person who doesn't turn away." Cal lowered the letter, a profound stillness settling over him. He had spent his career being defined by destruction, by the necessary violence required to keep the darkness at bay. He was a breaker of things, but here, on a piece of paper trembling slightly in the desert wind, was proof that he could also be a builder. He had planted a seed in the mud of a desperate night, and against all odds, it had taken root and was growing into something strong and beautiful. He picked up the photograph. It was taken on the front porch of the Gunner's Landing Lodge. In the center of the frame was Kaiser. He was no longer the scrawny, dying puppy wrapped in a gray blanket. He was magnificent. His coat was thick and glossy, his black and tan markings gleaming in the sun. He sat in a perfect, commanding posture, his chest out, ears pricked forward, alert and regal. Around his neck, stark against his dark fur, was a bright, patriotic red, white, and blue bandana. He didn't look like a pet. He looked like a sentinel, a guardian of the home front. On the back of the photo, Mia had written, "He waits for you at the gate every morning. He knows you're coming back." A rare smile broke across Cal's stoic face, easing the lines around his eyes that were usually etched by stress. It wasn't a smile of victory, but one of deep, resounding peace. He opened the leather-bound journal he kept in his breast pocket, a log of coordinates, radio frequencies, and mission notes, and carefully tucked the photo inside the front cover, right next to the picture of his father. He ran his thumb over Kaiser's image one last time before closing the book. For years, Cal had told himself he fought for his country, a vast, abstract concept of freedom and flags. But as he looked out over the hostile valley, watching the sun set behind the jagged peaks, the truth crystallized in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for a map or a government. He was fighting for nursing textbooks. He was fighting for Kaiser's second chance. He was fighting so that in one small corner of Pennsylvania, a girl and her dog could sleep without fear. That was the mission. That was the purpose. The violence he endured here bought the peace over there. Thousands of miles away, the sun was rising over Ironwood. The morning light turned the tall grasses into a sea of gold, and the air filled with the sound of waking birds. At the end of Gunner's Landing's long gravel drive, a large American flag waved lazily in the breeze atop a white pole. Below it, walking along the perimeter fence, was a young woman in medical scrubs carrying a backpack of books, her steps light and purposeful. At her side, matching her pace with a disciplined trot, was a large German shepherd, his red, white, and blue bandana brilliant against his chest. They walked together in the safety of the morning, two survivors who had found their way home.